For more autumn dawns than anyone can remember, skipjacks have set sail on the Chesapeake Bay. Autumn returns the letter R to the colder months on the calendar. And an R in the month means the oyster season. Like their fathers before them and their fathers' fathers, generations of Chesapeake Bay oystermen have longed for the dawns of autumn. To Native Americans, the name Chesapeake meant Great Shellfish Bay. European explorers described the abundance of its oysters with awe.
What I read in the history books about the oyster population in the Chesapeake Bay, that there was oyster bed miles long oyster bed, and they were so thick they were in reefs. Boats would actually run ashore. The ships would run ashore on not a sandbar, but an oyster bar.
Christened Chrysostria virginica, or hard-shelled from Virginia, this muddy, misshapen bivalve was soon recognized as among the world's most delectable. The method of harvesting them was a simple though back-breaking task. Adapting the technology of their Indian instructors, early watermen used long-handled tongs to scoop up the shellfish from the shallow water. By the early 19th century, having depleted the oyster beds of Long Island Sound and Cape Cod, northern oystermen began arriving in the Chesapeake, bringing with them a new technology, the dredge. These iron-toothed brackets, with attached chain bags, could be pulled by sailboats across the bay's bottom, raking the oyster reefs in wide swaths. Incensed by the plundering of Yankee drudgers, Maryland passed a law in 1820 banning oystering by non-residents. The solution for the New Englanders was an easy one. They simply moved to Maryland. With the expansion of railroads, places like Virginia's Hampton Roads and Crisfield and Baltimore in Maryland became the debarkation points for what had been a regional treasure. Now the oysters of the Chesapeake could become a national resource, with rail cars capable of carrying the canned and iced-down delicacy as far west as the Rocky Mountains. Following the Civil War, the nation's appetite for oysters created a boom of gold rush proportions. By 1870, 1/5 of all Americans engaged in commercial fishing were employed in the pursuit of Chesapeake gold. Thousands of dredge boats plundered the bay. Bloody battles erupted between tongers and dredgers, between Marylanders and Virginians, between oystermen and enforcement officials over the common ground of the bay's oyster beds. Still, the oyster boom continued unabated. By 1884, the annual haul in Maryland alone was 15 million bushels, yielding approximately 120 million pounds of oyster meat to an insatiable industry. But this was to be the banner year.
By the end of the 19th century, the harvest was under 10 million bushels. By early in the 20th century, it had dropped to below 4 million. In the 1940s and 50s, the average catch was 1 to 3 million bushels, still enough to support the most valuable fishery in the bay. There's no question, however, that oysters were the victims of overharvesting.
In 1959, a new threat made its first appearance in the bay. Multinucleate sphere unknown, or MSX, had decimated the Delaware Bay's oysters 3 years earlier. A protozoan, it now began its assault on the Chesapeake. It was soon joined by yet another microscopic parasite called dermo. What was left after a century of overfishing, these two diseases now seemed ready to finish off.
The problem which these diseases pose for the oyster fishery is that they generally kill oysters just before they reach market size. So we've often used the excuse, therefore, that if we don't harvest them, the diseases will. Now the problem with this is it works counter to evolution, because in harvesting young oysters, we're taking not only those that would have died, but those which had developed some desirable traits like resistance to disease. And so, in essence, we failed to protect and conserve and nurture this really important part of the population, and that was the disease-resistant oysters.
I've always been an optimist. I've always thought it's going to get better, it's going to get better. I'd never realized that the disease was this bad.
Since the appearance of dermo and MSX, we no longer see oyster harvest in the millions of bushels. Now we're lucky to see it exceed 100,000. Today, the oyster population of Chesapeake Bay is about 1% of what it was in the year 1870.
When we lost all these oysters, 84, 85, 86 year, that's what changed my mind about coming back naturally. I don't think it will happen now.
They can be fried or frittered, baked, broiled, stewed, steamed and scalloped, roasted, or simply swallowed raw. But all of these culinary uses pale in comparison to the remarkable role that nature has created for the oyster. June brings warming temperatures to the bay's water. At 72 degrees, oysters will ignite a reproductive chain reaction. A male oyster is capable of releasing billions of sperm cells in a single mating episode. Not to be outdone, the female will respond by releasing millions of eggs. Together, their reproductive output can cloud the bay with microscopic cells. Predation will immediately begin to take a heavy toll. If fertilization occurs, the larval oyster will undergo a rapid transformation before embarking on a 2-week period of mobility, free to float about in the bay.
As an oyster reaches the final stage in its larval development, it has only a limited amount of time to find a suitable substrate for settlement. And not surprisingly, the preferred substrates are other oyster shells, especially those with older living oysters in it. An adult oyster actually releases a compound known as a peptide, which can attract other larval oysters to settle on it.
If a suitable surface is located in time, the infant oyster secretes a kind of animal superglue. Once attached, they are known as spat, and this will become their permanent address. By the following June, the spat will be about the size of a teaspoon. They will be sexually mature, however, and most will be males. Oysters are protandrous, or male-first hermaphrodites. Since males become females, and the young spat are constantly setting on older oysters, a reproductively self-sufficient colony will begin to arise on the bay's floor. If allowed to build up over successive generations, this bar or reef of cemented oyster shells would grow to immense proportions.
At one time, oyster reefs covered millions of acres in the Chesapeake. Some rose as high as 60 feet off the bottom and truly posed a hazard to shipping. But what the dredge boats tore down in the 19th century was far more than simply a threat to navigation.
An oyster reef is like an underwater apartment complex. The oysters might be the landlords, but they are not its only tenant. Every surface, nook, and crevice, including the inside of the oyster's own shell, provides a home for something else. As many as 300 other species have been identified as sharing the oyster's abode. The reason for this is rather simple, since this three-dimensional structure provides 50 times more habitat than the surrounding flat bay floor. Many of these permanent guests share what ecologists call a commensal relationship with the oyster. Those species find food and shelter among their benevolent hosts. This rich concentration of life attracts an abundance of hungry visitors, making the reef a prime destination for many of the bay's other commercially and recreationally valuable species. Certain commensals, such as the blenny, a small, secretive fish that protects its eggs by nesting in old oyster shells, are the reason why. A prolific spawner in its own right, its young are among the favorite food of larger fish. The oyster is not just a bystander in the bay's food web. Although it is the builder of one of the estuary's most productive and important habitats, there is another vital role for the oyster. After all, it too must eat. Oysters are filter feeders. The beating cilia surrounding their gills creates a small current, which draws in a kind of Chesapeake soup, a rich and complex mixture of natural ingredients.
The oyster is particular about what it ingests, preferring phytoplankton. Stuff which it filters and wishes not to ingest are packaged in a mucus-like substance and rejected as pseudofeces. This pseudofeces, together with feces which have actually passed through the gut of the oyster, can be an important mechanism for removing carbon and nutrients and energy from the water column down to the bay bottom where it can be ingested by other organisms.
The oyster has a hearty appetite. As time-lapse photography reveals, adult oysters are capable of pumping and straining up to 2 gallons of water in an hour. The simple act of eating makes them the bay's most effective water filtration system. It has been estimated that prior to the 1880s, the oyster population was capable of cleansing a volume of water equal to the 18 trillion gallons of the Chesapeake in a matter of days. Today, it would take the bay's decimated oyster population over a year to accomplish the same feat.
Balance is the key to a healthy ecosystem. Too much or too little of anything can upset that balance. The oyster is like a natural regulator that helps maintain a balance by filtering and repackaging plankton and sediments. In this way, it plays an absolutely critical role in the ecology of the bay.
Although warnings regarding the destruction of the oyster ecosystem were first voiced more than a century ago, it has taken until now for people to arrive at a consensus for dealing with the crisis. Jim Wesson, head of the Oyster Replenishment Program for the Virginia Marine Resources Commission, is one of those people. Once a waterman himself, he now works at building new oyster reefs to replace those now known only to history.
A lot of mistakes were made in the past because we didn't know any better. It was easier to harvest reefs when they were flat on the bottom than it was when they were three-dimensional, so most of the reefs were knocked down to facilitate harvesting. We also made mistakes when we tried to do restoration, in that rather than taking care of the natural three-dimensional reefs, we went and tried to recreate reefs on bottom, that oyster reefs that never existed before. And what we found from nature was that oysters never went back to these places that they had not been before.
Oysters are particular about where they live. If they weren't, the entire Chesapeake Bay might have been one vast oyster reef when John Smith arrived in 1607. Today, the great oyster reefs are only a memory. But we know where they once existed from survey maps that were drawn 100 years ago.
Our goal is to work with nature rather than against it. What we're doing is we're building these structures and hoping that the oysters will colonize them. The reefs are built out of shell, and they're about 1,000 feet long, 100 feet wide. They're made to be intertidal in that they come to the top of the surface of the water at low tide and they're covered at high tide. We know that oysters evolved in reefs so that the three-dimensional structure must be important to their ability to survive. When we started looking at the reefs, we really didn't know what the value would be. We didn't find any baby oysters on any of the outside of the shells, and we didn't really know how to explain that. And then we found that if we turned the shells over and looked deeper into the piles of shells, we started finding baby oysters. And what that told us was that the structure of the reef itself was protecting the baby oysters from predation. On the outside of the reef, they had been picked off by crabs and fish, but inside they'd been able to survive and they grew big enough for us to see. The second thing that we found that reefs do is that they let the oyster grow faster. They put it up in the water column where the water is better. By doing that, we get bigger oysters quicker, and it makes the potential for spawning greater because we have more big oysters. The final thing that we found that reefs do is that it puts the males and females in close proximity to each other. Oysters can't move. They're attached to the shells, and in order for a male and female to spawn efficiently, they have to be close to one another so that once they release the sperm and the egg, there's a better chance of them fertilizing.
The results from these man-made reefs have been more than encouraging. Oysters are maturing and spawning here despite the fact that the reefs are sited in high salinity, disease-ridden areas of the bay.
It is true that Dermo and MSX thrive in high salinity waters, but it's important to remember that this is also the natural habitat of the oyster. Right now there are oysters in the bay that are old and fat and healthy, so they must have some disease resistance. If we allow the offspring from these oysters to recolonize restored reef habitat, certainly some are going to die, maybe many are going to die from diseases, but others are going to go on to become the brood stocks for future generations of disease-resistant oysters.
In addition to allowing these man-made reefs to repopulate naturally, steps are being taken to jumpstart the process. In a remarkable collaboration between watermen, the Virginia Marine Resources Commission, and the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, mature disease-resistant oysters are being transplanted to Jim Wesson's reconstructed reefs.
The first year, oysters were bought from Tangier Sound watermen and moved across the bay to the Great Wacomico River. These were big, healthy oysters that would have been sold and eaten otherwise. The following year, after the first reproductive season on the man-made reef, what we found was incredible.
When we moved the Tangier oysters to Great Wacomico, we saw a tremendous increase in spat set. In some areas, a 10-fold increase, in some areas, a 1,000-fold increase. And this increase went out as far as 6 miles away from the reef.
But the journey wasn't over for some of these survivors. Their next destination would be back to the eastern shore and the University of Maryland's Horn Point Laboratory.
We're looking at several ways to get oysters to survive in the Chesapeake Bay. The two main ways are learning to manage around the diseases or to try to find an oyster that is immune or resistant to disease. We have emphasis on both programs in this facility. So we have oysters here from as far away as Texas, Louisiana, all the way up through Delaware Bay. We breed those, we evaluate them in outplanting programs to see is there a superior survival by using some of these other stocks. But we're talking about a long-term program. And we're also talking about a cooperative program. There are lots of people around the region that are doing similar things, and the cooperation is getting better and better every year.
Millions of the hatchery-bred larvae will be released into large holding tanks. Here, they will set on shells that have been bundled into mesh bags for ease of handling by volunteers.
We have a staff here that allows us to run the hatchery component, but when we go to making shell bags and moving several thousand bags of oyster shell or spat out to the river, we don't have the manpower here at this research facility to do that. That's where people in groups like CBF come in and the Oyster Recovery Partnership.
The Oyster Recovery Partnership is a nonprofit co-venture of watermen, environmentalists, and aquaculturists, and it is our charge to increase oyster populations in the Maryland waters of the Chesapeake Bay for both economic and ecological purposes. I'm going to drink. You notice how people run from activities like this? Yay! Now, then we have to get on the boat, won't we? The partnership working here at the University of Maryland at Horn Point has an oyster hatchery program where we try to get as many oysters as possible annually into nursery areas, and that's what we're doing today. This seed, once these oysters grow to a size where they can be let loose in the wild, will end up in two different types of projects, either projects working with members of the fishery or ecological restoration projects.
The spat-covered shells will remain bundled together for protection from predators in this shallow water nursery until the oysters mature to a size where they can survive in the wild.
We handle about 22 million oysters a year. These oysters that we're working with today will probably end up in the Chesapeake Bay Foundation's oyster gardening program, but some of these other oysters as well may end up with a fisheries project here in the Choptank River.
I started oyster gardening about a year ago because when we first came to Oxford, nearly 30 years ago, the oysters off my dock were that big, and now there aren't any more at all.
And I started gardening about a year ago because I had never seen those oysters. And by growing oysters off our docks, hopefully we're going to be creating new oysters that will hopefully filter the water, and someday we will restore the quality of the bay with this effort.
It took mankind and two parasites a little more than a century to destroy 99% of the Chesapeake's oyster population. It's going to take more than a few years to restore it. Man-made reefs and oyster gardens are just two of many projects currently underway in an attempt at turning the tide toward recovery.
What I'd like to see one day is if you came out here in a boat, you look down, you'd see clear water, you'd see the reef structure, you'd see big oysters and fish, just like Captain John Smith once saw.
The oyster is the most important animal in the bay. It's no longer sufficient to maintain a population just to support a modest level of harvest. We must also restore oysters to a level where they can fulfill their ecological functions in the bay.
To make a living, you got to work hard on the water. I love what I do, and I hate to see oyster declining so that we can only power dredge it. Sail dredging is a beautiful way to harvest oysters. It's pretty. I hope someday that it'll come back so we can sail again.
Although the mistakes of the past are still very much with us, now is the time to consider the future. crisis has a way of bringing people together, of forging new alliances. From a true common ground of understanding and commitment, the Chesapeake may once again become the great Shellfish Bay.